good evening everyone and welcome to the Metta Centre, another beautiful Friday evening together, sharing the Buddha's teachings. Tonight we're very fortunate to have Tony Lenart here today, and Tony was the Deputy CEO of the St Vincent de Paul Society and the Australian Chairman of the Hunger Project, and he's always been interested in humanitarian causes, and one of the things that we'll be hearing about more today is his work in Africa. So we look very much forward to the project there, and also the topic for this evening is how he was able to help end 2 wars in Africa. I'm very excited to hear, and in fact the talk that he'll be presenting today is a similar presentation as the one that he provided at the Global Buddhist Congregation that celebrated the 2600th anniversary of the Buddha's Enlightenment. So we are so pleased to have you here today. Thank you for coming, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here, and I'm really looking forward to sharing a little bit more about the sort of work I've been doing, and to some degree the links to Buddhism, given that this is a Buddhist centre. So it is great to be here, and I'm going to make this a fairly relaxed talk, more just sharing with a few friends rather than, some big, powerful speech. So hopefully it's something that you will enjoy and find interesting. So you can see up here, this is me as Dharmavada. So this is taken in Uganda with Buddha Akita, who is Venerable Buddha Akita, who is the first African monk in the world, which is kind of extraordinary to think that 2,600 years after Buddha's enlightenment, we are having the first person from a continent to actually be a monk. I'm told that I was the first white Buddhist monk ordained in Uganda, and something like the 4th or 5th he thought in Africa. I'm not sure about that one, but at least the first in Uganda. But it was only for a very short period, and something I very much enjoyed. So there are just a couple of the different photos of me as Dharmavada, and this is also in Uganda with the daughter of a cook from the institute that I set up there. We had about 20 employees and a number of trainers and training rooms, and did all sorts of programs. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. So that was Vanessa there. And this is me in India. I've also had a strong connection with India, with Buddhism, with the Eastern traditions, as well as with all of the other religions of the world. One of the talks that is on YouTube is myself as Dharmavada talking about the benefits of Buddhism for Christians. And so it's explaining to Christians the benefit of this model that how we can understand Christ the monk through Buddhism in a way that might escape Christians who don't have as much of that tradition and don't normally learn about the underlying reasons for people becoming monks and nuns, moving beyond their attachments, etc. So that was a homeless kid, by the way, that I found on the street. Really gorgeous little boy, Shivani. And this is me presenting on Asta TV on Hinduism and on the benefits of meditation. And this is in Uganda again. At a major talk with a former managing director of the World Bank and the governor of the Reserve Bank, the Central Bank of Uganda, and the finance minister there. And this is in Sudan with the very august and upmarket chairs and building of the Inspector General of Police. But let me, I think, just talk a little bit more about my work and what took me there to do it. So, I've always been interested in personal development, particularly since the age of 12. I decided that I would, actually probably, might have been 13 or 14, I decided that I would work my way up to be the head of one of Australia's largest companies, but that I would then teach other people what I had learned and what had helped me, and that personal development would enable me to achieve the ability to help others, the ability to grow and to contribute and to be as happy as possible and to be as productive and successful as possible. And then that led me on to spirituality, which I guess to my mind is in many ways a refined aspect of personal development. And so it goes beyond, you could say, the American teachings of, you know, you can do it and make it happen and the ideas of success, to a deeper level of inner joy, inner peace, inner awareness, contentment, and ideally beyond that to a place of enlightenment. Using Christian terminology, a oneness with God, a oneness with Jesus, using New Age terminology, a oneness with the universe, using other terminology, just connecting with Atman, with Buddha nature, with the essence of who we are, such that we live a life of complete joy and peace and happiness. The reality, of course, is things will always throw us up and down. There will always be challenges one way or another. But if we're able to deal with them in as helpful a way as possible, then we can have true joy. And one of the things that I quite like with Buddhism is there is this teaching of kusala and akusala, which is about skillful versus unskillful. So the typical teaching within the theistic traditions, like Christianity and Islam, is that you have heaven and hell, and you have good and bad, and you'll be punished if you do the bad thing and rewarded if you do the good thing. Whereas Buddhism talks more about skillful versus unskillful. And so it's not so much, oh, you terrible bad person, you did this, as it is, if you really have a look, you might find that the way you were thinking about things, the way you acted, the way you cognized or approached the situation, or the paradigms from which you operated in, or the model of reality from which you operated, might well have worked against your long-term happiness. And through gaining greater insight into yourself, you can actually be happier. And I feel when you come from that perspective, you're more likely to get people to transform than if it's like, no, bad! And so that is in fact one of the key elements that I guess I took in doing the work I've been doing in Africa and in working with rebel leaders. If you go to a rebel leader who has a pistol on him and there's a number of military people that might shoot anyone they dislike, it's probably not a good idea to tell them that they're evil bastards. But if you can actually sit with them and help them to be more joyous and more successful and happier and more fulfilled, then you have a partnership, then you have the ability to really work together. And so from that perspective of helping people to be more successful, not just in the surface level that they're currently aware of, but in the deeper level of what they truly want from life, then you have the capacity to create major transformation and major changes. So I had worked in a variety of jobs in Australia. I grew up in Sydney. At the age of 12, I was running a part-time photographic studio and doing photographic work. I don't know if any of you know the old Stanley Stamford school cases, kind of plastic cases. And I got foam and I put that in there, and I had done a lot of newspaper rounds and earned myself a couple of $1,000s from selling newspapers at the side of the road and going to hospitals on the weekend. And so I saved up my money, I gave it to someone that was going to Hong Kong. I said, can you go buy me this top-of-the-line Nikon and telephoto zoom and micro lens and flash and motogrive and all of this? And he got me all this stuff. I put it in the Stanley Stamford bag, and I felt confident no one would steal it from me, because who's going to steal a school bag from a kid? And I did a lot of quite senior level photography, earned good money, and then I later became a salesman and then sales manager at the age of 18, travelling around Australia selling encyclopedias, which was also a tremendous place to learn about attitudes and the importance of attitudes. And so, again, within Buddhism, it teaches a lot about the underlying approach, you could say attitudes, to life and to how we think. And I discovered when I was selling encyclopedias just how important that was. If I went out and I had a negative attitude, I would not sell anything. And if I went out with a really positive attitude, there was a very good chance that I would sell. And it was amazing just how frequent that was. That, hello and welcome.
Sorry, I apologise.
No problem. Please join us. That's great to have you.
That's okay.
And she doesn't know English, so she's parked in the wrong section.
Yeah.
We usually park. Yeah, sorry.
Outside.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about this.
Okay.
Yeah, apologise.
Sorry.
So, what was I talking about? Encyclopedias, yeah. So basically, with the encyclopedias, what I discovered was the attitude really did make all of the difference. And I think that got me sat on the path of how do I use this to transform not only myself and those who are working for me, but to work more broadly. When I saw the opportunity to work in Africa, and there was also the possibility of working in China, working with a number of leaders, I thought, okay, this is very powerful. If it can make the difference between me selling nothing for weeks on end, or setting company records and selling 10 sets in a week when the average is 1, what else can it do? And what if I was to teach this to rebels, to people that might otherwise be creating problems in the world? And what if I was to teach it to vice presidents and ministers and presidents and help them to be successful in transforming their countries? And so that is what I did. I went over to Africa to do that. After working with St. Vincent de Paul Society, and that was a great organisation, it does amazing work. It has thousands of stores, actually sorry, that's not quite correct. It has thousands of centres throughout New South Wales and Australia, 60 homeless centres, and I think I was saying it was about 27 years ago, so I'm a little behind on some of the figures, but they have numerous youth centres and centres for women that have been beaten, and all sorts of things. So they actually have thousands of centres, and then what they're best known for is the 500 stores where, of course, they sell second-hand clothes, which and they give them to the poor people that need it, so they can actually get their clothing and some of the basics with dignity. So I've been doing that and really enjoying it. I left them and I joined a group called the Hunger Project, and that was working on helping to end hunger around the world. It was established by someone called Werner Erhard, who had started a group called EST, later known as Landmark, which was teaching personal development. And he was teaching people to take responsibility for their lives. That no matter what occurs, we should be asking ourselves, what is the best I can do in this situation? How can I learn from the situation? And what would be the best thing for everyone? And so it's not that one blames oneself or that one takes on the whole world, but that one asks, given the situation, what can I do? And Werner was teaching this, but sometimes people would say to him, well, there's all this hunger in the world. Are you really saying we should be worrying about that? And Werner recognized he couldn't really be teaching about taking personal responsibility if he ignored everyone who was suffering, if he ignored the hunger that was in the world and the 40,000 children that were dying every day of hunger. And so he decided, I will take responsibility. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that he alone will transform it, but it means that he would do what he could within reason. And he started looking at what causes hunger, what causes poverty. And he got caught up by this pea soup of ideas. Oh, it's all to do with distribution of food. Oh, no, it's the economic system. Oh, it's to do with the economy. No, it's to do with agriculture. It's to do with this, to that. And he got caught up with this pea soup of ideas, of conflicting viewpoints of what actually caused hunger. And then he came back to recognizing that many of the aspects that were the underlying causes of hunger were the same things that he was essentially teaching in his personal development courses. And so he recognized, for example, that if we have a viewpoint that there will always be hunger, that it's inevitable, that there will always be poverty, then why bother? It's always going to be like that. So let's not bother. Or if you have a viewpoint of scarcity, that there's only so much in the world. Sure, it'd be nice that everyone benefits, but reality is it's them or us. If you have that attitude, you're not going to be doing much to help others. You're just going to be fighting against others so that you're the one that wins. And he also recognized that for many people, they simply didn't believe that hunger could end. So he decided to make the idea of hunger an idea whose time has come. Marcel Proust has a beautiful quote that more powerful than the march of 1,000 armies is an idea whose time has come. And so he set about creating a shift within people to recognize that yes, we can end hunger, that yes, it is possible. And he got over 1 million people from over 100 countries signing a form saying, I am committed to the idea of hunger ending. And not long after that, they had this children's summit in 1990, and all of the world's leaders gathered together and made a commitment that they would actually work to ensure that there was no country in the world with an under 5 mortality rate above 100. That's a similar measure to what the Hunger Project had come up with, as a measure of the point in which hunger is no longer the primary concern within a country. And so it's not that he said there will never ever be anybody hungry in the world, but he did work, and the Hunger Project worked to create the conditions in which, by now, there's very, very, very few countries where hunger is the primary concern that stops the flourishing of humanity within that country. There's still problems, still violence, there's still diseases, but the average person is not just focused on getting a meal. And so here's someone that really inspired me, because I saw that I could bring my understandings and insights about people, about attitude, about shifting our thinking and approach and belief systems and ways of seeing the world, and that might make a difference. And so I ended up bringing over the leader of the Hunger Project in India. And I had been working with a number of clients from Cisco Systems, which briefly became the top company in the world, the most valuable company. And I had helped them to become multi-millionaires. I've been helping them in a number of different aspects to become better leaders and to improve their business. And obviously, a company like Cisco, there are so many different groups and so many different people doing amazing things. That was only a very small part of that. But in these people's cases, it was at least a help in them becoming multi-millionaires. And so I suggested they might want to give some of that back, and that there was the opportunity for the Hunger Project to set up in Africa, and that if they donated $500,000 Australian a year, they would enable that to occur. So they did that, and the Hunger Project set up in Uganda, and at that point they had a close connection with the president. The vice president was on their board, and there were some great opportunities. So I went over with some of them, spent some time in Uganda. We had a forum with a couple of hundred different people looking at how do we end hunger, how do we reduce poverty significantly in the country. And we had farmers, and we had academics, and we had ministers of government, and top business people, and poor people, and disabled people, all sorts of people from all aspects of life, looking at that question. And one of the things that really came up as a key thing was that they believed that it was important to transform the leadership, and it was important to help individuals to transform. And so I thought, well, that's what I do. Let me come over again, and I'll provide that. And I came over, I ran a course for about 50 people, and then I ran other courses and other courses. And within a couple of weeks, I had requests from 36 organizations wanting me to train 3,000 people. And it grew from there. So this was my first trip with the Hunger Project. In the back is something called the Epicenter, which was an innovation of the Hunger Project to create spaces where the community would gather and work together and help and teach and provide medical support and all sorts of different things. And the land was provided by the community, and then they provided the money to do the building. This was another teaching I did elsewhere in a school. I think that was the only desk there. The kids were sitting on the floor, the concrete floor. This was a later teaching in a huge hall we had. We were expecting about 600 people, but there was torrential rain. And in a country like Uganda, where people don't have cars, it's obviously a lot harder for them to get there. This was one of the participants, a very senior person. On the right was my deputy chairman, so he was my deputy there, and Ahmed Docker is his name, and he later helped to apply the teachings on mediation that I've been given to actually having a rebel group give up their guns. And then next to him was the resident district chairperson for the main city, so he was kind of the representative of the president within that area and responsible for a number of different things. And then the person behind me, Robert Kayanja, volunteered to be the head of the Institute of Advanced Leadership of my institute in Uganda, and next to him is Abdul Mukasa Nessa, who was a volunteer with the Hunger Project, who organised those original talks and then came on board as a volunteer, and both of them later became employees of the Institute and did amazing work. You can see we were looking at vision and what everyone's vision was for their own lives and for Uganda. Something that saddened me was the response of one person who, when I asked what his vision was in 5 years, his answer was to be alive. For him, that was really about as far as he could go in terms of what's possible. That was the biggest thing that he could dream of. But other people really had amazing visions, and many, many of them put it into practice and created major changes. Some of the work that we did, particularly with a university, the World University of Leadership, that we helped to introduce there, we had people from, for example, one person from the UN, as his practical work within the degree, he helped many, many dozens of people to start many, many dozens of charities. And that was just one person. And so in total, the number of charities that were started was quite huge. The support to a number of charities helped them to be more effective. And what I noticed is that what would typically happen is people would come over to a place like Uganda. They'd see the poverty, they'd be moved, and many would want to help, which was absolutely fantastic and wonderful. And everyone helped in their own way, and any little bit of help was critical and important and made a huge difference. But what I noticed was that most people came from the perspective of, oh, I see some suffering, let me help it with that, rather than stepping back and saying what would create the biggest impact, what would create the biggest difference. And so just as an example, some amazing people came over, fundraised, got a lot of money and built a school. And that's fabulous because it gave hundreds of kids the opportunity to go to a decent school that they otherwise may not have. But had they used that same amount of money to teach teachers to be better teachers, to be more inspiring, to teach in a way that was real, that was practical, that gave children a deeper understanding of what they're learning, rather than it being some purely academic, rote-based, memory-based learning, they could have helped thousands of teachers for the same money, who would have then reached many, many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of students. And so I did notice that very often the work that was being done was not quite as effective as it could be. And part of that is the way in which the charity sector is run, and part of it is the way in which donors look for how they can help. Now, understandably, donors do want to know that the money goes to the right place. That clearly is very important. And there are particularly African-run organisations. Some of them are just looking for a quick buck for themselves. So that's very important. But then what comes as a result of that is that people just look at the tangible. Oh, you have built a school, great. Oh, you have built a hospital and you have 20 doctors, great. The fact that that hospital may not have the drugs that they need, that the doctors might be doing 3 different jobs and not really care about the patients, that once the donors or the initial people that started it leave, that it falls into disrepair, that may not be taken into account. Whereas if you create a shift within the consciousness, within the thinking of particularly the top leaders, you may have nothing tangible to show, but the impact could be enormous. If you stop a war, then you don't need all of those orphanages you otherwise would need. You don't need as many hospitals. And schools can be set up in a way that they can really work. And agricultural extension services, teaching agriculture to people, can be done in a way in which that agriculture, those farms can thrive because they can work on a long-term basis instead of worrying that rebels are going to take over their land and force them to flee. And so, if there is anyone watching this video later who is from the development community, my encouragement would be to focus more on the thinking, the attitude and the approach to create transformational leadership that creates profound and deep changes throughout society in a leveraged way, rather than just focusing on the tangible elements, which often are relatively temporary. This was a talk that I gave to, I think, about 1,500 people at the main stadium. And it was actually a Christian-Muslim dialogue. So I was teaching about love. And I was looking for opportunities where I could actually teach more about love. And so it was a forum in which I was able to share about it. They were mainly Muslims, so I talked within the framework of reality of Muslims so that it would inspire, help them to be more loving. And then for the Christians in the audience, I was pointing out that Christ's one commandment is to love as he loved, an unconditional love. Metta, as this centre is named after. And so I reached tens of thousands of people through those talks. This particular one here was about 5,000 people in one talk. I also gave corporate talks. This is the main pension fund in Uganda, and I'm working with the directors of the fund, both the top level staff and the board of directors. It was actually quite a corrupt fund. Normally I wouldn't say anything negative against former clients, but that's just like very well-known knowledge. It was in all the newspapers and TV and everywhere, and the former 3 managing directors had been thrown in jail for corruption, as well as the chairman of the board. And so we were working on transforming the way in which the fund operated. And I was able to create a shift in the way in which the top leaders thought about their role, which then enabled the new managing director, the one seated here, to actually create some massive changes that really transformed the organisation, in many ways made it a model that was really looked up to later on by many people in society, and that helped it move from a multi-million-dollar company to a multi-billion-dollar company, and also helped to create a situation where the payout of pensions went from often taking months to taking days, and where people could just use their phone and get an instant balance instead of having to wait for a long time and having to pay bribes just to get the information about how much money they had in the fund or getting their money. This was when I was a bit younger, working with the Air Force in Australia. And this was in Malaysia, working with about 160, no, hold on, might have been 350 IBM employees, the entire workforce of IBM in Malaysia. And as you can see, I have even been presenting from a fairly young age. I think I was about 10 or 12 there. This was the roofings company, and was doing an experiential program with them. And this was the view from my favourite house in Uganda, which was just stunning, looking out over the water, and a lot nicer than some of the other houses that were cheap, but not so nice. And this was travelling around the country. This was in Rwanda. So basically, I worked to shift the level of leadership and to help leaders to become more effective in the work that they did. And what was so nice in doing that was that I was able to help leaders. By the way, I am showing some pictures here, but they're not so important. These are just some background photos. So. What I primarily focused on doing, so probably the video should be facing towards myself for this. What I focused on doing was to help leaders to be more successful, to learn more about people, to learn more about themselves, to achieve better results, and to be able to be more confident in their capacity as leaders. But in doing that, to create a greater wisdom, a greater awareness of what they could do, and to see new possibilities, to end wars, to create a legacy, to create major transformation and changes in their country, in their companies. And so by working at both of those levels, to help the individual to be more successful, but also teaching them to be more loving, more understanding, more wise, it created a situation that really worked very well. And as people did the programs, they became more successful, and then people saw how successful they became, and then they wanted more programs, and that led to more and more work. To the point that it was a little bit overwhelming at some points, and also a little depressing. For example, in Rwanda, I devised, partly in conjunction with the head of their National Unity and Reconciliation Commission, a program that would help to literally train the entire country of about 8 million people. And so the idea was that we would train over 100 trainers, and that they would then go out and train up to 1,000 people at a time, and that we would start with the top leaders and all the religious leaders and all of the judges and all of the military and all of the politicians, and that it would then go out to wider levels of society, such that a program that actually created an inner transformation would occur in a country where a great percentage of people, the Hutus, had killed a huge percentage of the rest of the country, the Tutsis. and where there was, understandably, an enormous amount of tension and aggression and anger and fear from both sides. And everyone talked about reconciliation, but little work was being done on it. And so that was one of the programs that I developed, and I developed a program that I wanted to do with the top 3,000 people in Congo, but getting the financial support to enable that to occur was an immense challenge. And if I have failed, I would say the main failure was in getting the money that would have enabled some of these amazing things to occur. But what we did was to impact thousands of people, and that led to the opportunity to then work with rebels. And so you can see here, these are some of the military of Congo. Many of them are very religious. This was actually a pastor. And by working with the rebels, we were able to create conditions that actually helped lead them to ending the war that they had. So this is in Goma, which is the capital of Eastern Congo. And there's been an enormous amount of turmoil, enormous amounts of problems there for a huge amount of time. This here is Kampala, which was my primary base from which I operated. And you can see there's a range from quite developed to semi-developed to undeveloped within the country. This is what we tend to think of when we think of Africa. The giraffes and the elephants and all of the wildlife. And we might think of the gorgeous children, we might think of mud huts with grass-thatched roofs, and yet the reality is there is such a range within all of Africa. The squalor of slums, through to nature, through to high-rise buildings, and everything in between. It is in many ways a very beautiful country. The people are in many ways wonderful, extremely friendly, extremely open, and very down to earth. And so it's been a fantastic opportunity to work with people like that. So, I mentioned about Congo. And I ended up being asked to train about 40 of the ministers in the rebel government that were controlling half of the country, Eastern Congo, Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, at that time. So I've been doing some trainings in Rwanda, and someone who attended the trainings was actually a relative of the main rebel leader. I'd been training the main phone company, MTN, training all of their customer service staff, doing 5-day programs on customer service. Occasionally during the lunch break I'd rush off and talk with the head of a ministry within the government. In the evenings I'd sometimes be going to the university and presenting there and then coming back. So it's quite full on, and after 10 days of this training I was exhausted, I was in a tracksuit, I didn't bother shaving, and I was enjoying just relaxing. I think it was Saturday, and I get a call can you meet the Prime Minister of Eastern Congo in 15 minutes? Okay, I'll do my best. I left my half-eaten meal, I ran back to the house I was staying in, shaved, got into a suit, went on to this meeting with the rebel leader that was acting as the Prime Minister of half of the country. And he wanted to end the war, and there was a dialogue occurring that was bringing together some top people. Nelson Mandela, who was actually involved in that, a number of countries were involved, and the UN, and they were bringing together all of the parties to the conflict. Now this particular group, RCD Goma, Rally for Congolese Democracy, Goma, had been the main people that had prevented any peace deals in the past. And there were different meetings in South Africa and Libya, and they had actually got in the way of it. But their leader, Zeres Ribeiro, wanted to actually take advantage of this possibility and to form a government of national unity. And so he said, can you train my leaders, first of all, to have the skills that if we do find peace, that they could get jobs. And then secondly, to shift their thinking so they're open to the idea of creating peace. And so I devised a 5-day program for them. And I was talking with Zeres on the phone, and he said, can you come at this date? And I said, oh, I'm actually busy then, but I could come a couple of weeks later. I said, okay. Now that particular date when he had wanted me to present, there was a massive volcano that destroyed half of Goma, and enormous destruction. And so they weren't able to actually do the training. So basically there was so much destruction. The houses of some of the top leaders, as well as so many of the people in the country, were destroyed. And he said, look, you can't come over now, which of course I expected. What I didn't expect was the next sentence. Can you do it in a... just to clarify, the date I was meant to come over, there was a volcano. I then came over, I think a week later, so I could present a couple of weeks after that date. And he was saying, no, that's too early, wait another week or two. And so really, just after the volcano, I was there presenting to his people. I presented to 40 of the top leaders, the ministers of the government, and he said, look, I want you to stop the training. This is too good to only be given to our ministers. I want everyone to attend. And apparently every 15 minutes they would advertise in Kiswahili and French and in their local dialects on the radio. If you're with RCD Goma, come to Goma, attend this training. And it was packed out. There was, as you can see, standing room only at the back. They were fighting to get in. There were people with machine guns saying, we're full, and they were saying, no, we've travelled from overseas, we've travelled thousands of kilometres through some of the worst terrain in the world. It can take weeks to travel thousands of kilometres there because of the state of the roads. And you can see how studious they were. They really loved the training. Some of them had been selling chicken by the side of the road before becoming a rebel. And then maybe they became a rebel leader, but that was their only exposure to leadership, to management. And so having the opportunity to learn about leadership was something they really wanted. And the way I taught it helped them to be more successful as leaders, but also inspired them to look for how they could leave a legacy, to provide real meaning for why they got into fighting in the first place. For many of them it was a mixture of reasons, some positive and some from greed, but by connecting them with the positive and having them committing to the idea of leaving a legacy and having them look at the world they wanted for their children and talking about leadership from the perspective of it's being like a parent and that it's about bringing out the best in others, not just telling them what to do. That helped to create a shift with a number of them in how they saw the role of being a manager, being a leader. And the estimate from some of the top people, including this person who's one of the translators, the estimate was that before the training, 50% of the rebels said they wanted to end the war, but only 25% meant it.
Oh.
And that after the training, everyone was saying they wanted to end the war, and 50% meant it.
How do you measure the meant or not meant?
Say again?
How do you measure that?
Well, that's not a scientific measure. That was the estimate from some of the top people that were involved. And so that's just what they were talking about. But let me answer your question in a few minutes a bit more objectively by playing you a video where I interviewed one of the attendees, this particular person here, Tommy Lenart. He was the Minister of Education within the rebel government. And I came across him 10 years later in Uganda. And I said, tell me, what happened to these people? And I went through some of these photos that I had, and you can see him. And he's there going, oh, this one here, he's a director of a major organization, and this one's a governor, and this one is the head of the police in the whole of Congo, and this one started a university, and it was quite extraordinary, the results. So I guess that's the true measure. Yeah. And this person here, Azares Riberoa, he became later the vice president of Congo. So he was the main one I worked with. I also worked one-on-one with him. Though I was a bit worried at one point. I was teaching strategic planning, and I was saying to them, look, I'm going to teach you two methods, a very simple one and a more complicated one. The more complicated one was the sort of thing that you might teach ministers of government here or top corporate people, where you look at all of the possibilities and you create expected value, where you're multiplying the probability of something occurring times the expected value if that were to occur. Then in examining the weighted values, you're able mathematically to choose. And I was saying, but don't worry if you didn't understand that. There's also a simple method, and I teach a simple method. But one of the things that I did was I was saying, if you want to make a good decision, the first thing you have to do is to see as many possibilities as possible. If you're not understanding what's possible, that won't occur. And so I had them divide up into groups of 6 people in a circle. And I said, I want to make you as flexible as possible in seeing things from different viewpoints. So one at a time, I want one person to stand up and pretend that they are the government, that they are the president, President Kabila, from the government that is the enemy of the rebels, and to talk as though you were him. And to talk about how bad this RCD Goma is, and why you don't like them, and the trouble they're causing. And only when the person has done it so effectively that it sounds like him, can that person sit down? And so they had to put themselves in the shoes of what they saw as the enemy. And I did a number of exercises like that where I'm teaching one thing but also something else. And so it really helped in terms of teaching them strategic plan, and it taught them to put themselves in the shoes of other people, to be more loving, to see new possibilities. And later on, I met one of these people who had joined the government forces. He was a colonel, and he was sitting next to another colonel who had always been with the government. And he said, "Oh, let me introduce you. This is the guy that came to meet me when I was a rebel, and I was with all of the rebels." I said, "Oh, what was that like?" And the government guy said, "It was incredibly scary. Here I am going into rebel territory. They might shoot me. And I was thinking, what will this person be like? Will he be evil? Will he be unable to listen? Will he be incredibly hostile?" He said, "I sat down and he could understand what I was saying. He could understand my viewpoint. He was able to talk from a place of win-win. He was saying, how do we work together? How do we actually create something that benefits everyone?" He said he was so easy to work with. It was wonderful. And later I talked with the same person who had also done some later conflict resolution work. And the work he did was run by a very famous university. It was a wonderful program that was supported internationally by the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. And I said, "How do you compare the two different programs?" And he said, "Well, they were both extremely good and extremely helpful. The only thing is what they taught me was largely theoretical. And when I did come to a situation I could use it, I got out the books and it was really helpful." But he said, "With your teaching, I used it that evening with my wife. I continued to use it all of the time with my children, with everyone I was with. And so by the time that I was in a situation that I could actually attend a formal mediation, it was a part of who I was. It was how I operated." And so that was really nice feedback as well. And so these are the different groups, and you can see them in the circles doing the different activities. I was setting them. Now you said, how do I put the audio on so you can actually hear video?
You should play it from here.
Right. I don't need to plug it in?
No.
Oh, okay.
Let's turn up volume. It sounds like a lot of the things that you were doing with them uses the principles of nonviolent communication. A lot of things that
Yes.
Marshall Rosenberg used to do when he was still alive, to go and end wars and end
Yes.
conflict.
Yes.
Yeah. Have you ever heard about him or read about nonviolent communication?
I've heard the term. I actually haven't studied it, but I don't doubt that there would be a number of similarities in the approach.
Very, very similar.
You're from Switzerland, you see? Is that man from Switzerland?
American.
Somewhere in Europe? American?
He's American.
Yeah.
American.
He's very, very good though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I should research a bit more of his.
Yes, and he's got talks on YouTube where he does
Okay.
something very similar. So
Yeah.
very practical as well. And, and same thing, he can solve people's marriages as well as
Right.
wars as
Yes.
well. So.
Yes. The one thing I found really sad, I came across someone else. I'm forgetting his name. Something like Paddy O'Malley. But he'd actually created an enormous difference in helping to end wars across the world. And I was so saddened because as I was watching videos, he's saying, "Oh, I have this amazing opportunity, but I'm totally broke, completely broke, no money."
Oh.
And I thought to myself, isn't this idiotic? When it comes to wars, there are billions and trillions of dollars on hand. And yet when it comes to ending the wars, you have this amazing guy with no money. I personally was funded initially by the people I worked with, But other than that, I was basically doing corporate training to fund
Yeah.
the non-profit work. And when I would go to seek funding, either it would take an enormous amount of time, and yet I'd be in a situation where the work needed to be done really quickly, or it required tangible proof, which is hard to do when it's about inner transformation, or it required enormous amounts of work, which is not very easy if you are doing things on a shoestring and essentially doing it yourself. So when I was with St. Vincent de Paul, it would be very easy to say to one of the thousands of employees, or a few of them, look, put in this bid document, these are all their terms of references, go to the accountants, get all of the reports, put everything together in the way they want. But when you're trying to do everything yourself, it's very hard to do that sort of a thing. So, yeah. Let me just show you a couple of different things. So this is Tommy Tumway. As I mentioned, he was the Minister of Education within the rebel government. So thank you for coming to meet me. What I wanted is if you can just show me, these were some of the people, of course, as you know, that attended the training with you.
Thank you very much. See, that's one. His name is the operator.
Okay.
He's now the director of electricity.
So basically, I just showed him the same photos that I'd been showing you, and he went through them each, telling me who they were, director of a major organization.
Okay.
So she's a minister.
Very wonderful. She was General Secretary after the negotiation of Sun City.
Is that loud enough? Or do you... This is the maximum volume from here. You can hear? Okay. So the General Secretary of their party.
Become Vice President.
And the Vice President of the country. And basically he went through, and each of the people that he's pointing to were governors, were ministers, had to place very senior people.
Now he's one administrator of the company.
Okay. Well, of course, that's me. I know who that is. And I think these are the translators. Okay, and who's this good looking young man? And so that is actually on YouTube, what happened to the RCD Goma rebels after Tony Lenart's training, and he goes through and shares with it. One question that I did have, which I didn't quite get from him, but I asked a rebel leader that had gone back to fighting, is what percentage of the ones that I trained stayed in armed rebellion? And I'm guessing it might have been about 10%. It's hard to get these exact figures, but I figure if it's a 90% success rate to... there was an article that said I turned rebels into saints. Now, obviously that's very much of an exaggeration, but if 90% went from rebels into positions of influence and benefit and doing it in a way where they're looking at how do we actually help the country, then that's certainly helpful. So, to give you a little bit more of an idea, this is Congo.
At first, we used to hear 1 million people, 2, 3, 4, 5.
So he's now saying the number of people that died in Congo as a result of the war was initially 1 million, then 2 million, 3, 4, 5 million people have died as a result of that war. Now, it's not necessarily from bullets. The primary way in which people have died is because the farming hasn't been able to occur as it would if there was not a war. And so people have been starving. If they had any problems, there was not the ability to be treated properly.
The situation is getting worse. Are we going to have to wait for 20 more years before somebody does something to stop this Holocaust?
There's a global consensus that exists that says it's okay for nearly 6 million black people to die in the heart of Africa and for us to be silent.
Now facing a critical juncture in their history, the Congolese people need us to change the way we're involved so that they can have the space to start rebuilding their country.
So, when you see these prescriptions coming out of Washington and they say, well, we tried everything, you know, we support peacekeepers, we've had peace talks, it's usually within the parameters of maintaining the current order.
The West has often approached Africa as a patron or a source of resources rather than a partner. But the true sign of success is not whether we are a source of perpetual aid that helps people scrape by. It's whether we are partners building the capacity for transformational change.
So somehow the audio has got out of sync there.
Well, do you want to play again?
It's okay.
Is it usually like that?
That's fine. So that's just giving you a little bit more of an idea of the scale of the conflict. It actually was described as it's known as the Second Congo War, the Great War of Africa, and I actually noticed on Wikipedia it's also known as the Third World War. Maybe I can say I've helped in World War III. I think that's a little bit of a stretch. But it really was a major war. It was the largest since World War II. It brought in people from many different countries from around Africa, either fighting on behalf of the government or supporting the rebels in order to fight, and then often with the benefit of having minerals sent back to those other countries. And so it was not a world war, but a war of many different countries, and led to millions of excess deaths. So yeah, by working with them, it did create that shift. They did actually end up attending this inter-Congolese dialogue. They shifted their thinking such that they were open to ending the war and amenable. They did indeed end the war. They did form a government of national unity. I put it in inverted commas because it's a bit of a stretch to suggest that they were truly united, but at least they weren't fighting anywhere near on the scale that they had been before. And Azarius, who I had trained, became the vice president. This is a personality profile I'm doing, where I'm dividing them up into the room according to their personality. And then this is some one-on-one work at the house of the rebel leader, Zeres Rebellion. He said it was the first time, this is by the water there, his house is on the water. He said it was the first time he'd spent any more than a couple of minutes actually sitting there. So I chose that to work with him because it was a nice location. But I did get worried at one point. A canoe came relatively close by with some fishermen. And I was saying, do your guards have binoculars to check if they have any guns, to check if they're a threat? And he said, no. So when I went back to my hotel, I got my binoculars, I returned and I said, here, please, give this to... The homework I had given him was that in order to rest and recuperate and come from a wiser space, I had taught him, I think, to meditate, and I'd given him the assignment to meditate, or at least to have meetings, to at least spend some time by the water in that relaxing situation. So I said, I don't want you shot while you're doing my homework, give this to your guards. And I donated my binoculars to him. So anyway, yeah, so they did end up the fighting and formed the government of national unity. There still have been a lot of conflicts, and one of the conflicts was that the government wasn't really living up to the conditions that it had given in ending the war. There was something called the March 23rd peace deal. And so I actually was over there a number of years later, and a new group of rebels asked to meet me, and they were saying, look, we're having this problem, we might be going back to war because the government isn't fulfilling their role. There is a committee which includes us and the government representatives, but they're not really trying to do the right thing. And I said, well, look, I don't want to just train you, but if I can train the whole committee, if I can train the government and your side, would you be happy to do that? He said, of course. And that afternoon I went to a restaurant, and they were kind of changing the system with mobile phones. You had to register. So I went over to the lady at the next table and I said, can you just call my phone? I want to check it's still working. And she did, and she was quite an extrovert. She just started chatting. And I found out that she was actually the senior advisor to the president of Congo on peace. And she was telling me about the difficulties she had with the rebels. And I thought, well, if they were willing to do a training on conflict resolution and mediation, would your people attend? Would you like that? She said, of course, it'd be wonderful. She then introduced me, like about 20 minutes later, a very senior member of the United Nations came to join us for a meal. And she asked that they fund it, but there were some bureaucratic issues. It didn't actually end up being funded. It didn't help. It didn't happen. Could I have some water, please? And the threat that the rebels had made, that they would go back to fighting, did in fact occur. And so it was the March 23rd peace deal that wasn't being fulfilled, and that became the name of the group, M23 Rebels, in memory of the March 23rd peace deal that they felt was not being fulfilled. But anyway, so I'll show you a video of that rebel group. Thank you, terrific.
The government of the Democratic Republic of Congo has rejected M23 rebel calls for truce talks in the east of the country. Faced with a growing refugee crisis, as most of the city of Goma's million-strong population seeks to escape, the government's bracing itself for a full-scale rebel assault of the regional capital. The government accuses M23 of being in the pay and control of neighbouring Rwanda. They in turn accuse the government of failing to integrate their forces into the National Army, a breaking of the terms to a 2009 peace deal. Our main objective was just to arrive here and show the main aim of our cause. We have no intention of going into Uganda, but if the Congolese army attacks us, we'll enter the city. The UN supports the government claim that the rebels are a Rwandan creation, while Kigali asserts they are just seeking to control valuable mineral rights. The UN has thousands of troops in Goma and has been providing helicopter strikes to support government troops.
So that was Euronews, and then this is Al Jazeera.
Flanked by his soldiers, M23's political head arrived for a news conference. Bertrand Bisimwa wanted to talk peace. His message was for the United Nations.
We will not fight against the UN forces. And we will not run away. We'll be there. And we will are there, I think. But we think that this is not the solution for our people. The solution for our people is a political solution.
So fighting is not a solution for our people. The solution is a political solution.
And not the war.
M23 believes the UN is advocating force as the answer.
So that is Bertrand Bisimwa, and this is a meeting with Bertrand.
What percentage of the people that I trained held on to the teachings, and what percentage forgot and became corrupt?
Maybe asking some investigation.
Just roughly.
But I think many people are trying now to do it, because the thing which they get there from you, it's very important. It was very important for them. And until now, in their political program, you can see they say that they want to change attitude in their program.
Okay.
If you ask them their political program, you see that it's very good. They feel that this is the only way in what we can change Congo. Yeah, if you change. If you see, because when they reach power, there was
Dislocated.
They left many political parties, and all those parties, if you see in the...
So you're saying every single political party is focusing on transforming attitudes and the need to change attitudes in the country.
Even us, when we were in CNDP, yes, we said that if we want to change Congo, we have to change attitudes.
So the training really had a big impact.
Yes, of course. Yes, of course.
So that was the meeting with him, and I'll just show you a minute of this.
Yes, my name is Tony Lenart. Companies or senior Kampala on my motorbike from the Congolese border, which we had crossed in order to meet him. So, okay. I'm too happy. That's okay.
She's pretty.
When you can see the humanity in everyone, then you no longer need to treat them as though it is the enemy, the bad person. You can work to simply help. And from that perspective of seeking to help, then
This is
even the worst people will want to work with them, to listen, to be supported, and to find ways that work for everybody.
The Ugandan National Rescue Front, they were a rebel group, and my deputy chairman, he negotiated for them to come back to mainstream society.
So as you can see, much as he may have been a part of a rebel group that has created some significant problems, he himself, at least in terms of the exposure I had to him, was actually a very decent person with some great aims. I don't know the full story. I only met him for a relatively small amount of time, and then he hadn't attended the training that I did 10 years ago, so he knows me better than I know him. He had 5 days of me sharing my philosophy. But what he tells me is that it did create a significant shift in the approach, and after this meeting was when you saw him on TV talking about political dialogue rather than fighting, and they did in fact agree to put down their guns and to come back to mainstream society. I don't know how much, if any, impact I had with that. The actual training, I think, was definitely a worthwhile component. This one I can't say with definiteness one way or another, but it was certainly at least great to have the ability to be meeting, and we certainly talked a lot over, I think, a couple of hours about a number of different aspects, looking at peaceful resolution and what we could do, and reminding him of the different things that I had trained on many years ago. So, yeah, life in Africa was not easy, but it was certainly very rewarding. This was actually in Sudan, and it kind of brought me to tears. This is at an airport. This is a children's playground, but a rather desolate one, which doesn't really fill you with hope and joy. Sudan is a very difficult place. This is a tank just by the side of the road. And they had been fighting for 40 of the last 50 years. So not an easy thing to overcome in terms of the attitudes. But again, a place where it is so important to do the work, to create that shift and that change. I worked with the Vice President of Sudan, Riek Machar, and did just a very brief session on conflict resolution and mediation. And after that, he actually had he brought together the rebels that had been creating major problems to try and find a solution that would actually work with them. This is the institute that we set up. We gave space underneath for other charities. Up here we had, we were working with an American university in order to provide a lot of materials that helped hundreds of Ugandans to learn the skills to enable them to be great leaders. One of the students was the youngest African ever to be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. After doing our work, he left the refugee camps and set up his own charity, did amazing work. He presented at the UN alongside all of the presidents of the world, and also at one other major organisation, I think NATO, alongside Medvedev and Blair and I think Clinton. And so he's been doing some pretty amazing things with it, as have many others. We had a library here. I bought lots of second-hand books over from Australia on the flights. I bought a number from bookstores there. I printed a number of my own books, which we included there. I brought over computers, and we had a computer lab with about 15 computers, and taught people how to use them and gave them lots of resources to use. We had volunteers staying there. We had a number of different lecture rooms and different staff doing trainings and all sorts of things, from leadership and management through to understanding people, through to dealing with HIV, through to presentation skills, through to personal development and conflict resolution. Worked with police and worked with orphanages and charities and politicians, and had Sudanese come down to do trainings, and had thousands of different people come through that we were teaching. At one point, my office was thrown into disarray. There were some staff that were wanting to take over the organisation. When I reported them to the police, they bribed the police, and I was thrown in jail overnight. And then they came up with some crazy charges as an excuse to actually try to take the institute over. So they charged me with forging my own certificates, which doesn't really make any sense. But they did that, and what were the other charges? Anyway, there was like crazy things like that. So I was found innocent. There were no criminal charges. So yeah, what's the correct term anyway? No convictions. I was found innocent. They were all those things, the criminal. But for 18 months, I couldn't really ask for donations. I was trapped in the country, unable to move. So it was a very difficult time. Another time I had someone break the door to my, it was my hotel room, but it was kind of like a separate cottage type thing. And so there's enormous lightning and thunder. I'm never really scared by that, but this night I woke up and I felt a bit scared, and I was shutting the windows, and then I heard a bang, and through the door I saw a rifle butt come through. And I go, hello, which maybe was a bit more like, hello, and the rifle butt went the other way, and the person left. I had to put the lounge against the door to hold it because he had broken the lock. So it was a challenging time. At another point, I was knocked over, they stole my watch. And yet at the same time, the vast majority of time was tremendously rewarding, working with amazing people, doing amazing things. And it's been a very rewarding experience when you work with people to transform their lives, as you here are working with the Metta Center, as I'm sure you have experienced in setting this up and in running it. When one makes a commitment, it is a mixture of enormous responsibility, financial strains, a lot of work. I'm sure there are a number of nights you'd prefer to maybe be at home just watching TV and relaxing, And yet, after a hectic day in court or poring over legal papers, you come to man the centre, to run it, to be here, in order to create that change that you know will spread throughout Sydney and the world with one drop at a time, and that impact that one can have on one's own family, on one's friends, and of course on one's own life spreads, and that is what creates growth in society. That is what creates countries and society moving forward. And so on the one hand, you have those challenges, but the rewards to know that you're having that impact, to know that your life has meaning, to know that your life is not just about getting a bigger TV or a more prestigious car, that value is incalculable, and that can't be replaced by really anything else. One of the things that I look at is that the vast majority of the world end up having children. And if they look at why they're having children, I think a large aspect of that is because they realize that through having children, you expand who you are. That sense of love extends, and you're no longer just thinking about yourself. When you get married, you're thinking about your partner. And hopefully, even before getting married, when you have children, it extends again then to the children. And so that, for the vast majority of people, is the way, the deepest way in which the heart expands, the ego, the sense of self expands to a greater aspect than the small ego, the small self. But if one recognizes that the most rewarding times in one's life, the greatest joys, the greatest happiness comes when one is with others, helping others, sharing, wanting others to grow, it makes sense that you might say to yourself, well, how do I extend this? So it is not just the one or two children I might have, but that it embraces a greater number. Because it kind of stands to reason that if the joys and the fullness that it can occur from expanding who you are to a couple or to a family adds to your life, then how much more when the way in which you operate embraces the entire universe. And indeed, one of the practices within Buddhism is the practice of metta, of sending love, with the recognition that at a deeper spiritual level, I believe it does have an impact on others. But even if it doesn't, it creates a level of fulfillment, of joy, of love and expansion of one's heart that makes you, the individual practitioner, happier. And so when we live our life with that recognition that we are happier when we help others, that's when you have the greatest joys in life. It's very challenging to work in Africa, very rewarding at the same time. And what I found was that through teaching personal development, through teaching spirituality, and when I teach spirituality, I do it according to who I'm working with. If I'm working with Christians, I'm helping them become better Christians. If I'm working with Muslims, I'm aiming to help them become better Muslims. If I'm working with Buddhists, I'm helping them to become better Buddhists. And if I'm presenting to hundreds of people along Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, to Hindus, I'm helping them become better Hindus. All of the religions teach us to love, and they teach us to live our lives more wisely. Why would we see another religion as an opposition, as an enemy, why would we have the ego to suggest that even though we may not understand the other religion, that clearly our way is the only way? All of the religions teach that we should do to others as we would have them do to us. And I know that if I were to marry a Muslim, I would want that Muslim to understand my own religious and spiritual beliefs and to appreciate and respect them. So obviously then I must respect and appreciate and seek to understand the religion and the perspectives and the spirituality of others, or I would not be fulfilling my own religion, my own spirituality. The other thing that in the title of this talk I referred to two conflicts. So the major one I've talked about was in Congo. There's also the possibility of that other rebel group in Congo. But the other thing that occurred was in Uganda. I was teaching mediation, and my deputy chairman, Madoka, got very inspired. And he said, I'm going to use this. He said, I'm going to put this into practice. And we had a meeting the next day with the minister for the president. His responsibility was to look after all of the things that the president wanted. And my deputy chairman was late for the meeting. I was, oh, what happened? You're normally very reliable. He said, there were these two staff members who were always arguing with each other. For years they've been arguing. He said, I set them down. I went through the mediation model that you were teaching. It works. And he said, I'm going to use this more. And indeed, he actually ended up going to the rebels that were in northern Uganda and seeking out their leader. And when the leader heard that he wanted to talk with them, he said, yeah, that would be terrific, please. So this is the leader here, General Eli Bamuzi. He said, please come to me. And so Ahmed Doka got in his ute and he started driving, and he was told to meet a rebel at a particular place, and he stopped, and the rebel came out of the bushes and hopped in the van with his gun. He said, keep driving. And he said, stop. And then a couple more rebels got in the back and said, go. Stop. A couple more rebels came from somewhere else and got in the back. And soon he had a large number of them. He was extremely scared and very worried and hoping he'd get out alive. And he arrived at this destination in the middle of nowhere, very dark. And this man came from a tent, walked out to meet him, General Eli Bamuzi. And he shook his hand and he said, thank you. Thank you for wanting to listen to my side. Let's sit and talk. And they kept on talking, and General Bamuzi said he would like to give up fighting. And what Mr. Doka did was to talk with the president of the country of Uganda, President Museveni, and he said that it would be, they agreed that they would give some land and some help in setting up farms if the rebels gave up their guns. And one day, he got a call from General Kazini, the head of the armed forces. And the call said, Mr. Doka, I want you to know that there's a military movement, hundreds of the rebels in uniform marching towards town with their guns. What do I do? And Mr. Doka said, well, we weren't talking about them giving up their guns, but we haven't really agreed. So look, please monitor what's happening and be ready if you need to, but stay out of their way. do not attack them, I think they probably want to turn in their guns. And they kept marching, and they came to town, and they came to him, and they gave him their guns. They said, we're giving up fighting. This was a ceremony later with President Museveni, General Bamuzi, the Deputy Prime Minister, and the other Deputy Prime Minister, Karigaya and Moses Eli, and they gave up their bazookas, they gave up their guns, and these had been children who were actually seized and forced into fighting. And they gave up the child soldiers so they could come back to mainstream society as well. So that's the second group that gave up fighting. So yeah, any questions?
Great. Amazing. Amazing work. Yeah. One question that I have in mind, which I don't think you'll have time to answer, so I'll probably invite you back next time. I would love to know more about what you taught.
Sure,
the
yeah.
training program. But I appreciate that some of them was like 5 days, and you probably could fit it into this talk, but I'd love to learn more about that. But maybe for today's purposes, if you have maybe in a nutshell some of the things that you taught, some of the principles you could share.
Actually, just as a side thing, I mean, a number of the things I taught were specifically designed for them and their situation. But interestingly, a lot of what I taught was the same thing I'd been teaching the Commonwealth Bank back here. And I find it kind of funny because now if I'm applying for work to train corporates in Australia, they say, but you've been teaching rebels in Uganda, what does that have to do with corporates here? And yet the reality is, what I had been teaching thousands of Commonwealth Bank staff and IBM and Oracle Systems and Cisco and all of these major companies was teamwork, understanding others, understanding yourself, managing in a good way, seeing new possibilities, finding win-win, looking for the best in others. And so many of those things I was able to teach without much adaptation to the rebels. I devised a number of things particularly for them, and certainly one thing I had to look at was the conflict resolution trainings. When you're teaching it to, let's say, a husband and wife, and I know you do divorce law, so you're dealing with the conflict of a husband and wife. If they're still together, you know that they have problems, but at least they probably want to overcome that conflict. If it's rebels, then the enemy might shoot them and kill them, and so there is an extra level to deal with there. But the underlying elements of understanding the other side's viewpoint and why they think that and how to find win-win solutions, to a fair degree that still applies. It just needs to be contextualized and made real and taught in a way that they respect and appreciate and are willing to learn from. And so, very many different things. One thing that I do find quite interesting is that so much of my work applies in many different contexts. And so when I tell people that I'm sometimes teaching Christianity or Buddhism or corporations to make more money or to be better leaders, or I'm doing teamwork or customer service or strategic planning, and that I'm also working with non-profit organizations and I'm teaching personal development, many people will say that that's a jumble, so many different things. Surely you can't do all of that. You can't be an expert on all of that. And yet the reality is so much of it comes back to essentially the same thing. Even within business, and I don't always use this word when I'm talking with business people, but most business people think that you would never talk about love and making money in the same breath. And yet, what is it that you do in business? You create value, you add value. And to a large degree, that's what love is about, is how do I help other people to be happier? If you are leading staff, you're helping to develop them, to grow, to be better, which is a form of love. If you are wanting to contribute as much as possible to your organization and you want to create an organization that inspires others to contribute to the organization, you need to create an environment that inspires love and contribution and a sense of service. Otherwise, all of your managers are only looking after themselves. And if you want customer service, that's about caring, that's about supporting, that's about looking after people, loving them. And so, just within those few examples, you can see that one topic can be applied, and certainly it's presented in a different way, but the underlying aspects can be there in many different contexts. And one of the things that I really like about my own life is that I do feel that my work, my spirituality, how I serve the world, my own personal growth, my own personal interests, are all synthesized. They're essentially one. They all support each other. And growth in one area helps all of the other areas. So I find that terrific that I can do it. And in fact, much as I say that I'm glad my own life has provided that, one time I wouldn't mind challenging myself and picking pretty much a random job. You know, selling tickets, being a cashier, working at a supermarket, doing whatever. I believe that in any job one has, if you come from that place of service, it can be a tremendously enriching and rewarding experience. I don't see that there are boring jobs or non-boring jobs. Certainly there are jobs that are more interesting than others, but if you come from that place of service, I think pretty much anything can be rewarding.
And with your institution, it still thrive and alive in Africa?
So the institute in Uganda is very much alive. There's about 25 people working there. It's managed by the Ugandans themselves, and they're running all sorts of different programs and helping many people with it. And then back in Australia, it's a lot smaller. So I'm doing some work for corporations who want training, and then I'm also open to the idea of actually working within an organization, providing training or learning and development, such that I can work at a more leveraged way, and to once again be back in the corporate work space where things are measured, where it's not just an airy-fairy, you know, yes, this will be nice, but that you can actually see the impact of things. And I intend to do that for a few years to build my own finances back, because I was primarily self-funded for many years and spent all my money on that. So wanting to build my own finances back. And then also, as I say, to work in an environment where excellence is supported and where there is a group that enables teamwork to occur, and where the logistics enable me to concentrate on what I love rather than having to do all of that, and where I don't necessarily have to spend so much time on the sales and the marketing and all of the business management that I otherwise would do. And then, after that, I intend to work internationally again, to work with a large organisation, something like the Bill Gates Foundation or something like that, in order to actually train dozens and hopefully hundreds or more other trainers that can do similar work to what I've done, and to create the shifts such that when there is a war, when there is violence, that before considering military action, that people consider how do we help the main belligerents to actually create a shift in their own thinking. How do we find win-win solutions? How do we work together in a way that will help to overcome this? And then also to help both myself and through training other trainers to create a situation such that if a rebel war does end, and there's a new government made up of those rebels, that there's work done with the rebels, with the new president, so that that president is able to update their strategies and able to operate in a way that is now about contribution rather than through creating terror, through fighting, through being unpredictable, and the other elements that had led to success in the past. Because if you don't create that deep level change in their approach to how they operate in the world and how they manage and how they see their role as a leader, then obviously you will create the same negative occurrences as have happened in the past. And so I wish to do more of that work and to train others to do more of that work. And I see that as my future number of years from now, operating internationally and hopefully with an organisation that seeks to create the deepest level transformation, to have the greatest leverage that can then help to make transformational leadership development a standard part of the development toolkit, such that anytime wars are occurring, rebels are acting, or where there is a handover of power, that there's people that can help and that can come in. I have no idea whether Kim Jong-un would have been interested in working with me, but it would have been really nice when he came to power that whether myself or someone else was there to help him to see his role in a way that would truly help the development of North Korea and in a way that worked with the world. If you don't do that sort of work and you don't create the conditions in which people are supported to do that, you should not be surprised when there are problems that occur later on.
And that's exactly the question I was just going to ask you. When are you going to go and speak to him and Trump?
Yes, well, indeed.
Just knock on the White House door. Hello.
That's right, indeed. One of the things, of course, that I like to do where possible is to get in as early as possible. And unfortunately, I think with both of them, that point has passed, and there certainly are some challenges with both of them. But at the same time, you know, if someone went over, let's say, with Dennis Rodman and worked with Kim Jong-un and hopefully was able to find a way of working with Trump that met his own ego and other needs, maybe then something more positive might occur.
Thank you. What I'll do is I'll upload your talk, I'll tweet Mr. Trump and send him this slide.
Sure, no worries. Well, thank you very much for having me and the opportunity to share with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
One last question.
Yes.
It's a very quick one. If someone watch this, feel inspired,
Yes.
want to be trained or become one of trainer, what would you be your suggestion to the person?
For that, sure. Well, I can provide my contact details at the bottom, wherever you access this. It's the Institute of Advanced Leadership. My name's Tony Lenart. Yeah, please contact me. info@peaceandprosperity.org or peaceandprosperity.org. You can find out more about it. If you're a corporation, go to advancedleadership.org, and I would love to work with you, love to help you, and then that would enable more of this work to occur around the world.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.